Build a house in one night, and the land was yours. That was the bargain whispered across the Welsh hills for generations. Raise 4 turf walls on the open moor before sunrise. Light a fire and get smoke rising from the roof by dawn. Do that, people believed, and no landlord could tear it down. Whole families bet everything on it. And the strange thing is, no such law was ever written. It appears in no statute, and in no court a judge would point to, and still the houses went up by the thousand. Some are lived in today, cottages now worth £250,000. The families who raised them got the ground for a single sleepless night. Tonight we put that claim on trial. Where the idea really came from. The strange dawn test of the smoke and the thrown axe. Why a landlord would ever let a squatter stay. Whether it held up even once in front of a judge. And the single detail in the whole story that almost everyone gets wrong. If you had asked anyone in the Welsh uplands 200 years ago why a grown family would gamble an entire night on a patch of bog, they would have looked at you as if the answer was too obvious to say out loud. Because they had almost nothing left to lose. To see how a poor family ended up that desperate, you have to look at what had quietly been taken from them. A few generations earlier, a landless man in the hills still had a thin floor under his feet. It was called the common, rough grazing and waste ground that nobody owned outright and everybody was allowed to use. You could run a few animals on it, cut turf for your fire, gather what grew there. It made nobody rich. But it was the difference between scraping by and going under. Then, across the 17th and 18th centuries, that floor was pulled away. Landowners fenced the commons off, turned shared ground into private property, and the people who had leaned on it had nowhere left to stand. And building a home the legal way was already out of reach, for a reason almost nobody remembers now. An Elizabethan statute from 1588, the Erection of Cottages Act, had made it a crime to put up a cottage at all unless you tied 4 acres of land to it. 4 acres a day, labourer would never own in 10 lifetimes. In one line, the law had locked the poorest people out of ever building a legal house of their own. A landless family had no land, no legal right to build, and no common left to fall back on. That is the corner people were backed into when the one-night house appeared. It was what families reached for when every legal door had been shut and bolted in their faces. And the first thing that surprises people about it is how crude it really was. A tai unnos, they called it, a one-night house, and it was nothing like the snug stone cottage the name might put in your head. The earliest ones were dug straight out of the moor that the family was standing on. Turf cut into thick, heavy blocks and stacked into walls. Soil and clay packed into the gaps for strength. A few rough poles for a frame if they could lay hands on them, and a roof of thatch or moor turf thrown over the top. There was no foundation and no cut stone, nothing that needed a craftsman or a coin. That crudeness was the whole point. The thing had to stand between dusk and dawn, in the dark, raised by one family and whatever neighbours they could pull out of bed. Nobody builds a proper house in a night, but a low turf shelter with 4 walls and a fire inside it. A dozen determined people, working flat out against the clock, could manage that before the sky turned grey. It did not have to be sturdy or pretty. It only had to be standing, finished and smoking when the sun came up, because the sunrise was the moment the custom was tested. And that test is the strangest thing in the whole story. This was the belief as people held it across the Welsh hills, and in folk traditions a long way beyond them. If you could raise a house on common or waste ground in one night, and have a fire burning in the hearth with smoke rising from the roof by daybreak, then the house was yours to keep. The smoke was the proof. A cold pile of turf was just a pile of turf. A house with a living fire inside it was a home, and a home, by this old reasoning, was not a thing you could simply knock down. It got stranger, because the custom did not stop at the 4 walls. In the fuller version of the tradition, once the house stood and the fire drew, the new householder could claim the ground around it as a garden. And the way the legend is told, you measured that ground like this. You stood at each corner of your fresh-built house and you threw an axe as hard as you could. Wherever it landed marked the edge of your land. 4 corners, 4 throws, and the reach of a working man's arm became the boundary of his property. Sit with what that actually means for a second. The size of your world settled without a surveyor, a deed, a map, or a clerk by how far you could hurl a hand axe at first light. A strong man with a good swing woke up owning more than a tired or a weakened one. That is something far older and far odder than any law book, a folk right measured in muscle and smoke. Which lands us on the question this whole video is built around. If there was no deed and no surveyor, what on earth made any of it stick? Why didn't the Lord just ride up that afternoon and pull the lot down? The romance of the story runs straight into cold arithmetic here, and the real answer has almost nothing to do with honouring an ancient right. A landlord who found a fresh turf house squatting on a far edge of his waste was looking at 2 choices, and each one cost him. He could send men out to evict the family and flatten the place. That meant paying those men, turning a whole neighbourhood that had built it overnight into his enemies, and doing all of it over a scrap of rough moor that earned him nothing to begin with. Or he could leave it where it stood and quietly start treating the squatter as a tenant. Let them stay and charge them a little rent. For plenty of landowners, the second choice was simply the smarter business. The waste had been worthless to him. Now it had a family on it who would hand over a few shillings a year, work the ground nearby, and give him no grief as long as they were left in peace. The one-night house turned dead land into a trickle of income without him so much as lifting a finger. He let it stand for one cold reason. Tolerating it paid better than tearing it down. That gap is the quiet engine under the whole tradition. The one-night house survived because destroying it cost more, in money and in bad blood, than letting it be. The custom lived in the narrow space between what the law technically said and what was actually worth a landlord's money to act on. Which forces the next question, and the answer is going to land badly for anyone who pictures this as a guaranteed right. Strip the folklore off and stand on the hard legal ground, and you find something uncomfortable waiting there. The one-night house had no standing in the law that actually ran Wales at the time. None at all. The dawn smoke, the axe throw, the whole overnight ritual, not a word of it was written into English common law, which was the code that governed Wales in this period. There was no statute anywhere that said, build a house in a night and the ground is yours. A landowner who genuinely wanted you gone and was willing to spend the money and swallow the bad blood to do it, had the law on his side. Not you. The custom was exactly that. A custom. A widely shared folk belief about what was fair and not a right any judge was bound to enforce. A one-night family lived inside a permanent gamble. What kept them safe was a tangle of things that had nothing to do with paper. A landlord's reluctance to waste money on an eviction, the loyalty of neighbours who had built the place and would see that its destruction, and slowly, time itself. The longer a family stayed put, paid a token rent, and got treated like any other tenant, the harder it became for anyone to pretend they had never belonged there. English law did drag along a slow, grudging principle that ran in exactly that direction. Occupy a piece of land openly, hide nothing, and let enough years pass with nobody who had a better claim moving to remove you, and your possession could eventually harden into a right the courts would actually recognise. The principle existed to tidy up honest old confusion over boundaries between neighbours. A squatter family just happened to be running down the very same clock. Every season they survived untouched made them a little harder to uproot, until throwing them out stopped looking like a simple eviction and started looking like robbing a family of a home that had plainly been theirs for a generation. The honest answer to tonight's question, was it really the law, is no. It was never the law. It was something more fragile, and in a strange way more impressive than a law. It was a right the poor built for themselves out of nerve, custom, and the plain fact that they were already standing there. They did not wait for permission. They made the fact first and dared the law to catch up. None of this has to stay behind glass on a screen. The families who lived it were ordinary people who decided the old skills were worth the trouble of keeping alive. If watching this makes you want to put your own hands on the past instead of just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the medieval way store. It starts with the medieval bakery collection. The practical recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The sourdough manual is for keeping a living leaven of your own, and the sourcing guide tells you where to find real heritage grain. The bread is where the kitchen begins. And the Welsh were nowhere near the only people who reached for this, which is the detail that should make you take the custom more seriously, not less. The housing historian Colin Ward, who spent years cataloguing the one-night house, traced the same instinct far past Wales, into France, into Turkey, and across both North and South America, wherever landless people pressed up against ground that someone richer claimed to own. In eastern France, poor families understood they could take a patch of the commune's land if they could raise a house on it between sunset and sunrise. The younger ones would spend a whole winter secretly cutting and shaping the timber frame in advance. And then, on one chosen night when everything was ready, the family and their friends would gather on the waste ground and throw the entire house up, threshold to thatched roof, before the sun came back. In Turkey, the same idea hardened into an actual legal loophole, the gecekondu, the house placed overnight. Roof a dwelling and get someone living in it before dawn, and the law gave you a real opening to claim the land beneath it. Whole districts of modern Istanbul grew exactly that way, built in the dark by people the official city had no room for. The same stubborn idea keeps surfacing in places that never spoke to each other. Build it in a single night, get a fire going inside, and the simple act of living there makes a claim no paper ever handed you. When one idea grows up on its own in that many separate corners of the world, it stops looking like a quaint local oddity and starts looking like something far deeper. A near universal instinct among people with nothing, that the right to a roof is made by raising one and held by standing under it. By the early 1800s, whole districts had been raised exactly this way, and the map of upland Wales still carries their fingerprints. One turf house alone on a moor is a curiosity. Thousands of them, thrown up across a century, are a different thing entirely. They are a landscape. In the poorest, most rural stretches of Wales, where lost commons and rising population pressed hardest, the one-night houses did not stay scattered and alone. Families clustered. A son raised his own tai unknows a stone's throw from his father's. A cousin put up another beside it. Where one fire had smoked before dawn, a little settlement gathered, and then a hamlet, and the rough turf began to give way to better stuff. Once a family felt safe, they swapped the sod for clay, then the clay for local stone, until the desperate overnight shelter had quietly become a permanent home that might shelter their grandchildren. You can still read all of it on the ground if you know what you are looking at. Lone cottages perched on odd corners of what used to be common land. Field boundaries that bend in strange ways around a plot somebody once claimed with the throw of an axe. Whole districts whose pattern of small, irregular holdings makes no sense as anything planned, because nothing about it was planned. It was improvised one night at a time by people the official system had no slot for. That is a quiet kind of victory. A custom with no legal force, built out of turf by families who owned nothing, reshaped the physical map of a country. The lords held the deeds. The landless held the ground for the oldest reason there is. They were standing on it. How do you actually raise a house in a single night? The people who pulled this off were not working magic. They were working families following a method, and the method is worth understanding. Start from the truth that they were not building to last that first night. They were building to exist by morning. The real secret was never the turf. It was the labour, and the labour was the neighbours. One family could never do this alone in a night, and they were never expected to. The whole point was a community gathering in the dark, many hands cutting and stacking and lifting, all of them racing the sun. By the time grey light came up over the hill, the walls stood, the roof was on, and one task was left, the most important of the lot. Light the fire. Get it caught and drawing. Get honest smoke climbing from the roof, because that smoke was the whole line between a heap of sod and a home with a claim. After that first night, everything slowed down. The frantic speed was finished and the patient improvement began. Better thatch. Stone where they could find it. A proper hearth. A door that fit. A garden marked at arm's length and dug into something that could feed them. The one-night house was only ever the seed. What grew out of it was a real home, made permanent by the oldest trick there is, which is simply refusing to leave. One honest note before we close, because this channel does not hand you a fairy tale. The famous Welsh one-night houses belong mostly to the 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries, the age of enclosure, not to the High Middle Ages. But the bones of the idea run genuinely old. The medieval world already knew the practice of carving a new holding out of the lord's waste, and the deep belief that a lit hearth turns bare ground into a home reaches back far older than any cottage still standing. The turf houses are early modern. The instinct underneath them is medieval to the root. The next time someone tells you there was once a law that let you keep any house you could throw up in a single night, you will know the real shape of it. It was something the landless built for themselves in the dark, then dared the world to take away. We dig up the knowledge the modern world walked past. Would you have risked the night for a roof of your own? Tell me below, subscribe, and stay curious.